From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Our first presenter, Dr. Krista Lewis, is an associate professor of anthropology and chair of the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock. She specializes in archaeology of Southern Arabia and its relationships to the wider Middle Eastern and Indian Ocean regions. Dr. Lewis leads two major archaeological projects in South Arabia, one in Yemen and one in Oman. In Oman, she directs excavations at the UNESCO World Heritage Land, the Frankincense site of al-Balid. Her research engages issues of urbanism, foodways, resource extraction, craft production, trade, emerging globalization, multicultural interactions, and sustainability from prehistory to the early modern period. Dr. Lewis holds a PhD from the Department of Anthropology at the University of Chicago. Please welcome Dr. Lewis.
Al-Balid was a mercantile, administrative, and cultural center, an international port city with a local heart. This large walled city offers a window into the emergence of the globalized world that we live in today. Al-Balid is a large and visually stunning archaeological site stretching for over a mile along the Arabian Sea beach. Its history stretches from the late antique period to the early modern, and its transformations throughout that time have much to teach us about international commercial transactions and the cultural interconnections that generated and sustained them. And we heard earlier about, I hear myself loudly. We heard earlier from our speakers earlier, especially Dr. Knoyer, about some of the very early origins of globalization in this region. So trade and interconnection have a very long history in this area, but Al-Balid is a special place to look at the connections between these very ancient origins of trade and interconnection globally, all the way up to the modern world that we live in today. So there are many industries and products associated with the region during the height of Al-Balid, including aloes, metals, beads, textiles, ceramics, fish, and the plant dyes indigo and madder. Most famously, of course, Al-Balid is well known for having exported the regional specialties of frankincense and also Arabian horses. Even more importantly, a wide array of people and ideas from throughout the Indian Ocean region passed through the gates of the city. Just to give you a better idea of where we're talking about, I mean, you all know where Oman is, of course, but note the southern Oman, the Dhofar region, which is really in the center of the Western Indian Ocean trade circuits. Moving, I don't have a pointer to show you this, but maybe I could say. The reason I show you this map is just to highlight briefly the type of geography we're looking at in southern Oman and why it's special. Each summer, the Indian Ocean monsoon brings rain that turns this ring of mountains, if you can kind of see with the pointer, green, a lush green, and provides the moisture that allows frankincense trees to grow in this region. So frankincense are only, they're exploiting a very small area along the back slopes of the mountain. They need just a certain amount of moisture that comes from this Indian Ocean monsoon. Notice also down here in this other box where Salala is, this other area of green. In this view to the north, you can see part of the western end of the walled city of Al-Balid, and a closer view of that second area of green I pointed out. It's a lush tropical agricultural belt made possible by the runoff and groundwater from those framing mountains in the Indian Ocean monsoon. Unlike much of Arabia, which is famed for its deserts, Dhofar's unique environment makes it an ideal place to be able to found and feed a city. The agricultural products from Salala today are most famously bananas and coconuts and all their forms of tropical fruits. But what's even more interesting, in the understory of that orchard zone, all sorts of plants and animals are being raised. So it's a really highly productive belt. So a very special place. In this photo, you also see the locations of the most prominent structures on the site of al-Zayed. This is the there's the garden zone, the Citadel of al-Zayed, and the associated large congregational mosque, which you'll see both of those later. You might have seen some of the other unexcavated building mounds in that part of the site. I'll just go ahead while I get those up. The work of a number of archaeologists at al-Zayed has established the basic sequence of occupation, which can be bracketed into sub-periods, which you'd be seeing now when the slides come up, based on the visible architectural types, radiocarbon dates, stratigraphy, okay, we're getting closer, ceramic typology, coinage, and historic narratives. There you go. There's our phases of the city. So from modest pre-Islamic origins, the town grew into a thriving city, experiences a series of political and economic developments and phases of reorganization, reconstruction, and expansion for well over 1,000 years. So although we have structural remnants and artifacts from late antiquity, what you see in the upper right-hand corner that have been excavated at al-Zayed, due to the intensive history of building and rebuilding at the site, exposure to these earlier materials are necessarily rather limited. In this example, in the upper right-hand corner, you see some late antique vessels and also some house walls which are buried meters below a mosque, which is also below another mosque. So you can't just kind of remove all of these later periods to get down to the early. The photo at the bottom is the ground level view of the mosque that you saw in the last slide. It was founded by or before about the mid-10th century AD and saw a series of remodelings over the history of the town, as most buildings did. This mosque had a flat roof, a central courtyard, a square minaret, and an attached ablution facility in the back. Across the city, more than 50 other mosques have been identified, many small and square, most of which probably date between 1250 and 1400 AD. The Citadel, which you also saw in that overview shot, is the most prominent monument on site. Also has seen a series of rebuilds, enlargements, and increased fortifications from the 10th to the 16th centuries. It rose to at least 4 stories and had an interior courtyard. Ibn Battuta wrote in 1340 AD that it was the residence of the Sultan, highlighting al-Zayed's importance as an administrative center for the region. The south-facing view, also of the Citadel, highlights the lagoon surrounding the site and its importance for defense, as well as a source of fresh water for the site. So those runoff coming from the mountains across a lot of the Salalah Plain, you don't actually see the water. I mean, there are springs, but in a lot of areas you don't see the water. But right when you get to the sea, where these drainages occur, you get these freshwater lagoons, which have been important in settlement in Oman, since deepest antiquity, but certainly right up to the period of this use of this site. This is an artist's reconstruction of almost the same view. And the lagoons around the site could also provide a route of transport by boat. Al-Zayed's most impressive defenses face the sea. The south city wall includes a series of regularly spaced massive towers, which you can see here, and also in all these views, but up close and an aerial view. The city also has a number of monumental city gates, as well as other less grand entrances placed around the city wall. There's also evidence for locations where boats moored for offloading and taking on goods and supplies. For example, the small gate, which seems like it's up in the air on the city wall shown here, probably had a wooden pier that you were to reach the gate from. The impressive architectural features certainly speak to significant local political and economic power, but a really wide array of imported goods excavated from al-Zayed also provide evidence for its far-flung global connections. Ceramics, coinage, and a variety of other artifacts from al-Zayed include material of origins in Yemen and East Africa, from Egypt, northern Middle East and Persia, from India, wider South Asia, Southeast Asia, and China. Glass and wood have also been found at the site from multiple origins across the Indian Ocean. In 6 seasons of work since 2013, my team has been working to add a new dimension to our knowledge of the site. Our research at al-Zayed seeks to understand the daily activities of the people who lived and did business there, examining the patterns of urban life as they develop uniquely in Southern Arabia in the context of its far-reaching global trade connections. Our work focuses on two different sets of methods over a range of scales. One is very tactile, traditional excavation, looking at the spaces where people lived and worked, what they did and who they were, through the minutiae of their material culture. The other dimension is high-tech, involving detailed mapping on the ground and from the air, you see here, and then using the digital data gathered to create three-dimensional models. This image is of a model of the entire site created from a composite of air photographs taken with an unmanned aerial vehicle. It can be zoomed in to a level where individual stones are visible. It's not easy to demonstrate that in a static slideshow, but here's an example of one of the images, and that's actually even at reduced quality there. This is a funerary mosque in the middle of the site. You can zoom it in and see individual stones. You can clearly see the individual surviving graves. So this is going to allow us to make a very high quality map. This is a false color digital elevation model, and so it may seem a little gaudy, but this kind of visualization allows us to see beyond what can be discerned just from a photograph. We can use image analysis to discern buildings, neighborhoods, courtyards, streets, and maybe even industrial areas in a way that's identifiable more than they are when you're actually on site, on foot, on the ground. And so this is allowing us to make a better, more I guess, an analytical map of the site, and then also identify areas targeted for future excavation. But also allows us to know things about the site without excavation, which is an important aspect of site preservation. How the city was organized is an important aspect of understanding the lifeways of its inhabitants. Note, for example, how, I'm not going to go too much into what you can see here, but the western end of the site is much higher mounded than what you see at the east. I'm going to, instead of talking about our theories for the east, I'm going to move on for right now and show you this image, which is facing northeast, to orient you, to bring you in closer to that high-mounded western end of the site. You've seen it in a slightly different angle from before. And this also brings us to the other lens of our current research project. So the area where we're excavating, this is before we started excavating, it's in this really strategic central part of the city, between the Citadel, which you see up here, and a major city gate of the site on the seaside. This is just another view looking the other direction from one of the major customs areas of the site to where the major mound is that we started working on, and it's close to the sea. So what's interesting about this is you can hopefully see that in this area you have very high multi-story collapsed stone mounding here and an open major street or courtyard. And this mound that we're looking at faces directly down this street or courtyard towards the Citadel. Up close, this is the mound prior to excavation, and I just wanted to give you a bit of a glimpse of kind of what it looks like as things start to emerge underneath that. It's pretty dramatic. There's a lot of work working through this rubble, but rooms and walls start to emerge. Our investigations are specifically designed to recover artifacts, spaces, and organic remains that look at daily life for the residents and the visitors to this port. Here's a map of what we've done, have we got here. So for scale, these are 5 meter squares, so we're looking at quite a large area. Our work has revealed areas of 2 major building complexes. You can maybe see the different orientation of the walls in this area and this section. I know this pointer is not ideal, but these walls are running much more north, south, east, west, and these are a bit at an angle. And there's a lot of rebuilds, is kind of a theme when talking about this site, so it's not one coherent plan, but we're looking at phases and phases of rebuilding and remodeling over time. For example, we can see where things that used to be standard rooms get subdivided or walled off. People no longer want to use certain areas, and they want to build on others. These 2 buildings do have deposits that overlap in time, so at least in the latest phases of their occupation, they may have been related as an extended family living compound. This is an example just to give you a glimpse of one of the rooms, right? Note these two doors. Here's a door, it hasn't been excavated. Since we've taken this photo, this room has been excavated as well. This is the same room, just a little more cleaned up, but you can see two entrance doors there, a hallway here. So all of these are excavations in progress, so you can sort of see the deposits we've come through. Okay, and these pictures then illustrate that are evidence that this was a multi-story building, right? So here you have a major staircase. It's leading up to a mostly destroyed upper floor of the building. We do have portions of that upper floor. So in this photo, you see a plaster floor upstairs being uncovered. That plaster floor is 2.5 meters higher than the plaster floor that we found at the base of those stairs. So we also have flooring in the room that I just showed you at almost the identical, within centimeters of the same elevation as the floor at the bottom of the stairs. So we're able to identify certain living levels on certain floors of the building. Also to kind of illustrate the architecture of the building, this partially excavated room, if you notice here, maybe you can just see a sort of strange marking. It seems like it's in the plaster of the remnants, plaster of this wall. This is a door. So we're just beginning to get in here. You just see the top of the door starting to emerge. And this is one of those doors that was intentionally filled later on. I guess they didn't want to use this room anymore. It was getting dangerous or dank in the center of the building. I don't know. You can also see where this wall is broken. And that, to kind of illustrate, is where the ceiling would have been for that room. We know things about how the ceilings were made and where they were because sometimes we find remnants of them, and that's what you see in the other photo here. This person is brushing out basically the plaster that was left when the beam that was there rotted away. It was part of the ceiling. So that's when the ceilings tend to collapse, is after the beams rot, but sometimes we get these sort of negative casts. So here's another excavation reveal for you. Prior to excavation, this north face of the structure was almost 4 meters high, a very steep mounding. So in almost the same direction, you can see after seasons of excavation, we removed a lot of that. Now it's here waiting to be taken away. And you start to see some early building walls and different phases of occupation. To flip it around in the same slope, looking at it directly facing south. I'm not going to go too much into that, especially because I don't have a pointer to really show you anything, but you have some very early walls built of a sort of larger, better cut monumental stone than we get in later phases. You can see where she's excavating, and here in the middle, some intentional fill layers in between this level and the levels that are above. We also have, this is a very interesting curved wall, almost tower-like. We're still working on trying to interpret that. So archaeological knowledge must be constructed and strengthened by multiple related lines of evidence from production, distribution, and consumption contexts, analyzed across all these different scales, from landscapes of regions to the city plans, the architecture, right, to things down to as small as microscopic organic residues or charred grains in a hearth. Archaeologists most often are reconstructing patterns of life from artifacts such as you see here. I mean, small fragments of pots, glass, coins. In the next few slides, I'm going to show you just a few highlights quickly of some of the things that we found in this building, in these two buildings, and what these artifacts kind of give you a glimpse of daily life. Sharing food, drink, and other consumable items, as we all just did, it's an essential way that humans everywhere show their cultural identity, display their status, mark social events, enact generosity, and facilitate financial transactions. The greatest proportion of the artifacts found in our excavation are ceramics, bones, and other items that tell us about eating practices. A significant portion of those artifacts and organic remains are related to practices of hospitality, generosity, and sociality. So the folks of this port may have been sharing their cultural way of life and their eating with other people. And I think that we're getting towards the level, and analysis is still ongoing, where we can start to pick out that there are African types of pottery and food items, there are Indian types of pottery and food items, they're certainly local. And so we're really interested in this sort of multi-ethnic identity of the port, and was it a place where we can really see people getting along and, you know, making relationships and generating these kind of economic transactions. Some other social activities we see evidence of include games, game boards. They chewed betel nuts. In the very latest phases of the city, tobacco pipes start to emerge, so they're smoking tobacco. We also have instruments. So music is something that, you know, we would know should be a part of a life in a city, and people enjoying time together and food, but we have some actual evidence. I mean, clearly, a sort of a wind instrument, the bone recorder or flute. Some pieces of inlay that you see. These are inlay possibly from a stringed instrument. I can't prove it, but there's some interesting wear along this. Someone is an expert in ancient instruments, wants to have a look, that'd be great. We also have a pick that might be a pick for an oud-like instrument for picking the strings. They were all found close by one another too, so that's interesting, maybe a musical section of the building. Oil lamps, another interesting piece of material culture that sheds light on an everyday reality of life in the city. Most of the oil lamps are small, like these, made of simple, locally made terracotta ceramics. However, we also found this much more elaborate star-shaped lamp. This is quite lovely, made of a soft soapstone, which is not found locally in the FAR. Evidence for this and also the other lamps that, you know, tell us that it was actually used for an oil lamp are the burn points, which I've kind of highlighted on this upper photo. Each point had a little wick and a point of light. The lamp was made to be suspended by an iron pin or chain through a central column. So with its multiple points of light, it would have been rather like a small chandelier, quite lovely. This is just a historic lamp from Yemen. It's not star-shaped, but just give you kind of an idea of how it might have been hung, how it would work. We also have some perishable artifacts, fibers such as this rope. This is a small fragment of cloth, which is still under analysis, but my expert thinks it might be silk. A beautifully painted wooden bowl fragment. Another class of artifacts that gives us a really, I think, intimate view of people who lived at al-Zayed is that of jewelry and personal adornment. Here are some examples, some of the many different types of beads that we find, sizes, colors, materials. Glass bracelets, we find a lot of glass bracelets, so shell bangles showed up earlier in a talk. These are glass. Perfume bottles, so your perfume bottle neck here, and also some bottle fragments in this shot. All of these items are identified, studied, and then we want to put them back into the larger context of where they're found for analysis. So I'm just going to bring you back to the excavation map again briefly to kind of talk about that. So we want to look, and we're still working on this analysis, but the statistical analysis of the patterns and how they relate to the architecture are helping us to understand not just what happened at the city or even just the structure, but down to the level of individual rooms and spaces. We mentioned that the musical instruments are coming from the same area, which was actually over here. I just had a student who's just finished measuring a lot of glass bracelets, and she's found that some of them are so small, the diameter, that they must have been worn by children, which is quite interesting. So we're looking not at just an administrative building where, you know, men of the town came, but a family space. So we have, you know, the women and we have children. And another thing that's quite interesting is almost all, I think except for one example of those child-sized bracelets, all come from 2 rooms, right over here. I don't know if we have a nursery. It's quite interesting. I want to just turn briefly to the building here, the second building that we started working in the east and we've been working west gradually over 6 seasons of excavation. And so we're relatively new getting into the second building, which seems to be, it's a courtyard, a large open courtyard with small rooms around it. And I just wanted to point out some of these interesting features that we have, which I want to show you up close. So this is another facet of private lives. In this courtyard, we have basins, or I think they're actually baths. So we have these lovely plastered baths. They're small by our standards, but they're deep, kind of deep soaking tubs. But they're slightly different in sizes. Here's one, here's another, here's excavators working on them. They have formal plastered drain systems. So they're very clean, I'd all believe. And they had a kind of very intricate system of water and drains, which we know some from elsewhere on the site too, but this is quite interesting for this house complex. For this excavation project, we've also developed and deployed a unique comprehensive mobile digital data system. And this not only facilitates rapid, comprehensive, paperless data collection in the field, but also integrates, and tracks all of this excavation data from point of origin through analysis into long-term storage. We want this to be efficient, but also to be able to share data more immediately, more fully, and more sustainably in a way that befits a global heritage site such as al-Zayed. And hopefully this will have more and more spin-offs for interaction of visitors to al-Zayed with the data in the future. Port cities are particularly dynamic places, both rooted in local patterns and cultures, but also loci for diverse multicultural interactions. They're places where not only trade goods and diverse people, but also a kaleidoscope of ideas, cultures, and ways of seeing the world come into contact. In al-Zayed's current role as an archaeological park, this is still as true as it ever was. Visited by diverse people from all over the world, in a new phase of its occupation, the city is a place where we both look to the past and forge a new future. Bringing together the two facets of our project, in excavation and digital recording, new horizons of interpretation, scientific advancement, and tourism become possible. So I just want to finish with acknowledging the many, many people without which this project would not be possible, especially the folks from the Office of the Advisor, including Dr. Sunli, who's here, and our team and everyone else who's working on the project. Thank you.
Wonderful presentation. Our next speaker is Dr. Joy McCorriston. Joy McCorriston is a professor at the Ohio State University Department of Anthropology and director of the ASOM Project, Ancient Socioecological Systems in Oman. She is an archaeologist with 40 years of fieldwork experience in the Middle East. That includes Oman, Yemen, Jordan, and Egypt, and has been conducting research in Oman since 2009. Her collaborative research has discovered the earliest dates for domesticated cattle and sheep in Arabia older than 8,000 Cal BP, and established that agricultural technologies trailed pastoral adaptations by some 2,500 years. In Dhufar, her team located and excavated monuments and tombs of multi-types as well as 2 rural settlements. Dr. McCorriston obtained her PhD in rural anthropology at Yale University. Please welcome Dr. McCorriston.
Well, thank you very much. It is a great honor and a pleasure to be here in such a wonderful setting and to see many familiar faces and many new faces with us today. I want to start by thanking, as our presenters have done before me, Dr. Deeb and the Sultan Qaboos Cultural Center and the Embassy of Oman for hosting this and giving us a chance to provide something of a snapshot of some ongoing projects that are, some of them are very visible and some of them are not so easy to see. And I think some of our work is going to fall in the latter category. So I want to talk about monuments, which are visible, and mobility and pastoral territoriality, which is really behavior. And as it takes some archaeological work to tease that out and make that visible. So those are topics that I would like to lead in today. What I'd like to do with you in the next few minutes is to explore what we can learn about the dynamic lives of ancient Dhofaris. And if you walk away from this presentation with one simple idea, it is that despite these really magnificent ruins that we've seen from other parts of Oman and the spectacular site of al-Zayed on the coast. So here comes the idea, are you with me? 95% of all Omanis who ever lived were mobile people, and of those, a very large percentage of them were pastoralists. So although I will not be showing you spectacular objets, I would like to make the case this afternoon that it is important to consider the lives of these people who have left a lot less for us to look at. I will talk a little bit about pastoralism and archaeology and some of these challenges, bringing that, of course, to the case of Dhofar. And in the spirit of the broader presentation today, although I am no expert on cultural tourism, I recognize that this is an important component of Oman's heritage, and therefore I would like to offer a few very amateur thoughts about that. So I hope you'll indulge me. Pastoralism in Dhofar, we now know that it began about 8,000 years ago. That's a long time. And through that time, pastoralism has been a dynamic system. It has also been a long-term adaptation, a way in which people have matched their social behaviors to the availability of resources, the distribution of resources, really developed a dynamic ecology. And in that process, over 8,000 years, pastoralists have changed their environment even as they have fitted themselves to this dynamic changing environment. So we talk about this really as a niche, a pastoral niche. The ancient Dhofaris shaped the world, and the world shaped them, so that they really hung on to pastoralism for a very long time. But what we understand about pastoralism tends to be very much framed from what we can see of pastoralist behaviors today, of the cultural anthropology, and I've met a couple of you who are or have studied cultural anthropology, and it gives us a really great understanding of behavior, but it gives us a very static sort of snapshot. I was there, I saw this for a year and wrote it up kind of impression of what in Dhofar is really a very long-term history. So in Dhofar, a really very wonderful portrait of traditional pastoral lifestyles was presented by a German man named Georg Janssen, who was in Dhofar in the middle 1970s and wrote a seminal work called Nomads in the Sultanate of Oman, which came out in 1986. And we've relied on that a great deal in trying to understand what traditional life was like. And so this image before you, it shows arrows that map onto Dhofar, and here I have to thank Dr. Lewis for giving us such a nice introduction, so I don't need to tell you about the monsoon. But this maps a kind of 1970s mobility pattern onto that landscape. And so the small sort of radius around a central point is meant to document the mobility of the traditional cattle herders in the mountains, who extensively relied on a grassland plateau, which is very narrow, actually. It's only, in some places, a few hundred meters wide. And these longer arrows map a mobility, a transhumance of camel herders back and forth across the mountains into the interior and from the coast. But this is the ethnographic present. One thing we've been doing as a team is trying to look at the dynamics of that environment, which is also not static. And I don't think that comes as a surprise to anyone in this room to realize that environments change. Ours is changing today. What has been learned very recently by some of the botanists from the Oman Botanical Garden and some earlier surveys is that the grasslands on that plateau, which provide this critical resource for for grass-eating cattle, those grasslands are anthropogenic, meaning that they were made by burning off the cloud forest. And that anthropogenic creation of grasslands is, in the botanical world, a fairly recent phenomenon. We don't need to get into how recent here. But what it does tell us is that there is change, and that the change is part of that pastoral niche creation that I was talking about, niche construction. So the project that I've been working with most recently is interested in trying to understand what those changes looked like over time and how people engaged with this changing landscape. One thing that we know about the changes in rainforest is that those changes not only happen on the plateau, and so this image shows you, I'm sure you've gathered by now, you can see grasslands on the plateau, and this very, very sharp and abrupt transition to these steep slopes where the cattle don't graze as much and you still have tree cover from that anogenesis forest. When you remove the trees from the grassland on the top, it has a spatial effect. Those monsoon clouds that Dr. Lewis talked about don't penetrate as far. They aren't drawn into the interior. And so it means that the vegetation way deep into the Nejd changes, and we heard this morning from Dr. Asalmi about the changes in the Nejd and how we recognize those are important in deep prehistory. But those cycles may have been changing in smaller cyclical events over time. So we are very interested in pursuing that and in pursuing the behavior and in adaptation of those many, many people who were pastoralists in ancient Oman. Okay, a little bit about pastoralists and archaeology, and I'm showing you a picture of a village in Syria. This is the only picture that is not of Oman, but I have a reason for doing this. This picture is a village that's made of mud brick. When these houses fall down after about 25 years, the mud brick crumbles into mud, or dry dust if you're in Mesopotamia. And it seals in and holds down all kinds of garbage that people leave behind. Broken pottery, pieces of bone, bits of copper, all kinds of things that can tell us about the ways people lived. Pastoralists don't live like this. They mostly don't settle in built houses. They move around with their animals because the animals need to move on once they've grazed grass. Meaning that we don't have the kind of site formation for ancient pastoralists. So archaeologists looking for a site will drive around and they'll see something really big and they'll say, that's great. And they'll learn about 5% of the people that ever lived in Oman, which is wonderful. But we have less of a record of the lives of other people, and therefore it's harder to understand their behavior. So places like Sumharam in Dhofar on the coast, we've also heard about it as Khorori, al-Balid, the oases of the north with the Aflaj are very highly visible, but very few of the populations ever lived in these places. The material culture of pastoralists is typically light, sparse, and often organic. Now, this is something that we can be grateful to cultural anthropologists for, again, because we can see how pastoralists live in the modern day. And being mobile people, they don't carry like one of those great big heavy Indus water jars or whatever they had in them that is going to be really tough to lug around, and if you drop it, it'll break. Pastoralists tend to make things out of leather, out of wood, out of basketry, out of leather-lined basketry if you want to boil milk. They tend to use things like feathers and dyes and thatch on, to make shelters. So my point is that these things decay. And so there is, without good site preservation, there's not a lot for us to find. So why is she doing this, you're wondering? Here are the problems. Pastoralists move around a lot, so the sites are very ephemeral. They aren't these big, deep installations with a lot of labor to build really solid, lasting walls. They don't practice agriculture, at least they did not in Dhofar, and that makes them very special in the world of pastoralists. But they don't leave a lot of plant remains for us to understand what they ate in the plant world. They don't want to kill off all their animals. This is not, the butcher's shop. These animals are precious, and so they are conserving them and using them for milk, and only killing them occasionally on special occasions. So we don't see a lot of animal bone from these very ephemeral sites. They're very mobile, so they're not carrying a lot around, and what is light, flexible, tends to be organic. They tend to have a tribal social identity for a long periods of time. So it means that who they see themselves as being is not really determined by how much gold they have, or how big a house they have, or how much wealth they've accumulated in terms of solid things. They tend to have other ways of identifying their relationships to each other as social groups. And they have very low population densities compared to, say, a place like al-Balid. This makes it difficult as archaeologists to figure out what to do. It's really very hard with this lack of information, even to look at the sites that are available and to understand the reuse of the sites. So it's hard, but what I want to do now is talk about the case of Dhofar and talk about what we can learn about these very important people who were the backbone of Oman's long-term heritage, one might say. The image, I lied, actually. The image on the, let's see, it would be your left, is not from Oman, but it is an image of a very widespread Bronze Age tradition of depicting pastoral peoples, and it comes from fairly nearby. It's an Arabian find, and it shows the very prominent dagger. And sometimes we do find these markers of social identities. On the right-hand side is a blade from an Omani tomb, which actually was excavated by two of our speakers this morning, Michael Harrower and Kimberly Williams. And one of the things that's interesting about this is it came out of a Bronze Age tomb and the edges are rolled. This was not meant to be used. This dagger had these finely blunted edges. So it was probably worn, a very prestigious object of identity, but not really meant to be drawn and used to kill anything. Other ways pastoralists are visible in archaeology include sites. They leave hearths. Some of that has charcoal that can provide dates. They clear vegetation. They move stones around. They drag them to hold down tents. They drag them to hold down animals, to corral animals. They put up little platforms to stick bedding on top of to keep it dry. We see graffiti and bedrock mortars, enclosures, all kinds of things that are left in the landscape. The other thing that they leave behind, and this is particularly important in Dhofar, is territory markers. And we see some on the hill here, right along there. And I believe you've seen some important tombs on hilltops earlier in this session. So these are territory markers. They often appear at places or near places where there are good sources of water. They may mark routes or hunting blinds. They may mark other well sources. And my teams have been examining these for a number of years, looking at them both in their spatial and chronological dimensions. Here you can see a platform or cairn. This is not one that we excavated, but it conforms to a type of Bronze Age cairn that we see there. This is a typical monument of about 2,000 years ago, a very different style of monument, but nevertheless a small-scale investment of labor in building these stone monuments. And here's a boulder that has been elaborately marked on the surface with petroglyphs of footprints, maybe snakes or winding water, some texts in a Dhofari script. So important points shaped and marked by pastorals moving through this landscape. We've also been exploring the chronology of these monuments, looking at burials in tombs, and also looking at the kinds of, not only the styles of the monuments, but the different periods in which they are excavated. So here you can see, again, Dr. Kimberly Williams excavating a tomb in Dhofar. The result of this work over a number of years has been to recognize the spatial distribution of a number of small monuments, but also differences in style and in chronology. And so we have been able to look at all of these different types, and I won't go into what they are, but I'd also like to point out that we have developed a data set that provides something of a pattern that's pointing to some kind of dynamism. So I talked about pastoralism being dynamic. We can see these markers are changing in style through time. We also can see that there seem to be some pulses of when things are being marked and territory perhaps is being expressed, and when there seems to be a more open system. So this pattern is the result of a number of years of work. And just a few images of some of these structures. This is a view of a platform structure from the Neolithic period. We have not found burials in this particular style of platform. That's a hypothesis to be tested further. I think we haven't excavated as many as we might like to. But for the moment, the evidence that we do have seems to point to some kind of commemorative event. Something happened, a big feast, a big gathering of people. We have some data from outside of Dhofar that kind of point to this sort of interpretation. And then a monument was put in place to kind of commemorate that large gathering. Other kinds of monuments later in time include tombs, which still are markers, and these are placed very high, very visible. They seem to tie people not so much to the memory of a gathering and a social community, but to a lineage and a genealogy, the memory of who was in this tomb, when that person was buried, when that tomb was last visited. So we see more of a chronological depth to the memories around these monuments and less of a large-scale gathering. So we see perhaps some change in the behaviors of pastoralists through time. And this may, in fact, be the beginning of these genealogical structures that shape the social identities as tribes. One thing that the project has been working on recently is there are some settlements. So I spent a few minutes telling you how difficult it is to reconstruct pastoral lifestyles from settlement, but we actually do have some. And it really surprised us that these settlements were as robust as they turned out to be. So we find little circular structures with some well-built construction, a kind of a beehive, corbelled vaults to them, 4 layers of floors so people would live in them. They'd toss down garbage, they'd put down more paving stones in the base, they'd live in them again, and we find 3 or 4 episodes. Sometimes the ground surface on these built up so much that you would have to walk down and stoop to get into these earlier ground surfaces where these habitations had been built. And here you can see in the background of several of the more recent team members a site that is in a kind of a basin or bowl and has a number of these stone structures, but they don't look like much on the surface. In fact, if you didn't know what you were looking for, you would think they were maybe 1 stone deep and there was not much to do there. So again, they're not visually deeply impressive, but they do archive information about an important constituent of Oman's heritage. Here's a map that we made. I'm just showing you this because I want to impress you with how wonderful my mapping team is. And so I don't personally take a lot of credit for this, but you can see that they've gotten a digital elevation model out of some remote imagery. In this case, we just flew a kite, and then they've gone around and mapped using an instrument the little corrals and cell structures, little buildings attached to those corrals. And you can see there's a number of cairns and platforms in this area as well. So chronologically and spatially, this is quite a complex little site, which I just showed you doesn't look like a whole lot on the surface. Some more images from that site, just giving you a sense of what the interior of some of these structures here. A quarter has been excavated out. Here we have a half with a nice entranceway. So you can see there's some depth. And we're able to find things in those structures like the occasional grinding stone. There's a lot of bone in there. It gives us a sense of what people were eating and what was important to them in their herds. So going back to that gap, I just wanted to remind you that we have now both settlements and we have small-scale monuments that are telling us about people's access to resources, the places that were important to build in, to stay in, to assert some kind of visual presence even when they were not actually present because they were wandering with cattle to temporary grasslands or forage areas. So we're actually now testing this map, this pattern with a model in which territoriality, behavior plays a role, in which we're looking at the shift from perhaps an open property regime, which would be in these periods when we know there are lower populations elsewhere in the Arabian Peninsula, and we would think there might be more of an open availability of resources and high mobility going back and forth to resources. As populations grow in better times, perhaps with a concentration around resources, there would be lower mobility, and in between, trees might take over in abandoned grassland areas, leading to a population decline in some of those areas and the return of grasses. So the project going forward is really testing this idea of there being a dynamic system that couples the human behavior, the human social dynamic and mobility with changes in the environment, with the shift between anthropogenic grasslands and the recovery of trees in between. So we're very interested in that long-term dynamism, and as I've tried to show you, the long-term changes where people are still, come back to using monuments over and over again to express their presence in a region, but doing so in some very different ways, kind of shaping monuments differently, relating to them differently as tombs or as platforms and gathering places. So I said I would end with a few implications for cultural tourism in Oman. Bear with me. The picture you see here is the picture of the interpretation of these very important people in Oman. This is the site that tourists are going to come to see. And you can see, well, it remains open for development. Pastoralists were the majority of people who lived in Dhofar. They did leave materials. They did leave material remains all over the place. And yet there is no really good public interpretation of ancient pastoralists that's focused on a site where people actually were. You can go out and look at these monuments, but they don't have interpretive signs, they don't have an interpretive visitor center, they don't have pathways to lead people around them and help people to understand how they actually fit into a landscape, and a dynamic landscape, how people have shaped the Dhofar that we can visit and see today. So I would argue from my very naive and amateur researcher position as a non-specialist in cultural tourism, that there is work to be done in cultural tourism, and that, that this is an important and overlooked part of Oman's heritage. So this is my final slide. I want to thank the tremendous support we've had over the years, and most importantly, I'd like to thank all of the members of the teams who have worked on various aspects of this project, who this would not have happened without you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. McCorriston, for your presentation. Our next speaker is Dr. Michael Harrower. Michael Harrower is an associate professor of archaeology at Johns Hopkins University. His research has focused on southern Arabia since 2000, where he began his fieldwork in Dhofar in 2009 and 2010. He continues work in Oman today as the Director of Archaeological Water Histories of Oman, or ARWHO. He is a specialist in satellite imagery mapping, and his research has been funded by agencies including NASA, the National Science Foundation, the Archaeological Institute of America, and National Geographic. Dr. Harrower obtained his PhD in anthropology from Ohio State University. Please welcome Dr. Harrower.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'd like to start off by saying thank you very much to the Library of Congress and to the Sultan Qaboos Cultural Center for organizing. It's a wonderful opportunity. I'm so pleased to be here and learn about all the excellent work that people are doing. I just returned from Cairo yesterday, so I'm totally on the wrong time zone. So I've never dozed off during one of my own talks, and I thought it's probably not a good time to start. So I thought I'd use the lectern. I would just start off by saying, you know, if we were to go out on the street in Washington and ask somebody about ancient Egypt and whether ancient Egypt was important, there would be no debate, right? Everyone would say that there's a wonderful archaeological history in Egypt and it's of global significance. But there's less recognition really of the tremendous work, much of which has been presented today about Oman, the new discoveries, the grand history, and the really critical role in the ancient world that Oman played. So I'm going to speed through today to give you kind of a little bit of a window into work that I've been involved with over the past 20 years in Yemen and in Oman, and including a kind of a focus on my recent project that concentrates along the border with the Emirates up here where you see Bat on the map shown here. So my most recent book, I kind of took a look at the long-term role of water in the history of ancient Yemen and compared that to the role of water in American history and the settlement of the United States and the American West. And despite this really obvious differences that we see, in culture, in language, in clothing, in so many aspects, I think what's really striking is that there are some broad underpinning similarities between parts of the world that we think of as being so very different. And this is where Oman really, to my mind, is one of the most important countries in the world today. If you think about the issues that we face in terms of cultural understanding, cultural interchange, war, conflict, climate change, the real answers to a lot of those, I would say, and really try to argue this in my book, involve building a mutual sense of understanding between peoples of the world, right? A common understanding of language, culture, history, by which we can build some shared values and understanding of how to proceed in a cooperative way to address these. And this is something that Oman has played a tremendous role in the world and really is a model of cultural and public diplomacy. So that is something I'd really like to highlight. So let's speed through here, and I'm going to start off with really giving you a lightning fast introduction to some of the periods we're dealing with here. So I spent a couple of years working in Dhofar, and I'm going to return to Dhofar and kind of give you some touchstones to think about. But most recently, I've been directing a project called the Archaeological Water Histories of Oman, or the ARHU project. And this has been funded over the last 3 years by NASA, involving archaeological survey, or basically exploration. And so as part of this exploration, we really touch on all sorts of different time periods, right? It was mentioned earlier this morning that really some of the earliest history of human ancestors in Oman goes back more than 1 million years ago, even 2 million years ago in the Paleolithic period. Then we arrive into the Neolithic period, where the development of pastoralism, agriculture, shows up. And this is a really critical, interesting topic for archaeologists. Why did the first people engage in agriculture and pastoralism? Then we get into this Bronze Age period, much of which you've seen some of the hallmarks today: Hafit period tombs, Narb period settlements, towers, and the Wadi Suk period. The Iron Age I'm going to touch on a little bit in terms of the production of metal and the international trade that goes on in that period. And then, of course, the Islamic period and the crucial role played by the political economy and circumstance at that time, which leads to the impressive and rapid spread of Islam through Arabia and throughout the world. So about 10 years ago, when I started working in northern Oman, we charted out a massive area to kind of look at. And today, there's many, many projects working in this area, Polish teams, Dutch teams, American teams, Japanese researchers. So it's really exciting to see really the knowledge of Oman and the history of Oman change very rapidly. In addition to sort of broad-scale exploration, driving around, leaving no stone left unturned, using satellite imagery, talking to local peoples, we also do a sort of statistical survey. And on the right-hand side here, you can see these little colored lines represent my teams walking and surveying in a systematic way on the ground to document everything we find in terms of the archaeological history. One of the most interesting sites we found, Abu Sway, is north of the town of Yankul, in which we're often centered. And I was there just recently with a French archaeologist, Dr. Rémi Cressard, who's one of the leading experts in lithics of the Arabian Peninsula. And I often get asked, Mike, what's it like to discover something transformative? And this is really an example of that, because I reached down into the sand, picked up this stone tool, handed it to Rémi and said, what is it, Rémi, what is it? And he immediately, I could see the look on his face, got very excited, because this was a level wa point, something he spent really his career studying, so it doesn't look like much to the untrained eye, but we know these are about 75,000 to 100,000 years old, and really paint a picture of some of the early people that are establishing themselves in the Arabian Peninsula. Other stone tools that get people really excited include facade projectile points like this one. If we think of the cusp of how hunter-gatherers transform into pastoralists, these are sort of centered about 8,000 years ago during that period. And we really, the people that produced these are very, very mysterious to us because we don't have, as Dr. McCorriston mentioned, really rich evidence from settlements that would tell us about the lives of people that produced these, but they are found widely throughout Yemen, throughout Oman, Dhofar, and likewise. Then we get into the Neolithic period. So these are found at a site called Wadi al-Lathli near Yanqul, a very, very large Neolithic site. So a couple of hectares, a couple of football fields in size, and all sorts of types of stone tools that we can recognize from the Neolithic period. You heard about quite a lot today, the work in Dhofar and in other parts of Oman having to do with Bronze Age tombs. So these are what we might call, in some parts of Oman, Hafit tombs or Hafit-like tombs. And these are excavations shown here in Dhofar, led by Dr. McCorriston, and skeletal analysis done by Dr. Kimberly Williams of these types of tombs. And they're so very interesting to us because we find tombs of this genre throughout the Arabian Peninsula, even up into the Sinai, throughout Yemen and Oman, and they fall in the range of about 5,000 years ago to a little bit younger in large numbers. This is another tomb from Dhofar that we found particularly intriguing because it falls in this range of roughly 5,000 years ago. We found a couple of these tombs in one of them. The first one discovered was found in Wadi Haluf, and that's how it gets the name Haluf tomb. And one of the interesting things we found in this tomb is a dagger that actually Professor McCorriston showed you some slides on. And really thoughtful archaeologists debate the chronology of this tomb, the chronology of this dagger. How did this dagger wind up in this tomb? Oman is really famous for copper production. So at the very early end, we're looking at about 3200 BC when Hafit tombs start to show up and we find copper production happening. And these are really exciting for us to think about. Where did the copper come from for that dagger? How did it find its way into that tomb? During the Umar period, we find some really impressive towers developed, and there's been a lot of work on these. There's more than 60 or 70 towers been documented by Dr. Charlotte Cable, Chris Thornton, and others throughout Oman's history. This one is one we worked on quite extensively and one's intriguing. Although this is 180 kilometers from the coast, it's got a pictograph on it of a boat, and we're really interested to think about how the people of this inland area were in connection with the coastline, were trading, were domesticating animals and whatnot. And these tombs are closely associated with water, and this is sort of a hallmark of tombs and towers. This is a well in the middle of this tower. So we did quite a bit of work reconstructing the landscape around Yanqul. This is satellite imagery and topographic data, and this orange areas here are showing the vegetation around Yanqul and the date palm oases. This is some of our publications of that work. And we did some 3D modeling. This is something that archaeologists have just really taken up with a tremendous passion in the past few years because this technology has become vastly less expensive. And so we did some 3D modeling of this tower to try to understand its construction. We did a whole bunch of on-the-ground modeling. So one of the things we realized is this tower was constructed by blocks that are almost as big as one of the tables up here at the podium, and they're just enormously heavy, and it's so interesting to think about how these were moved. But one of the things that's an advantage to us is these blocks are so heavy, that most of them that have fallen over didn't get very far away. So all these little black dots are blocks that we mapped on the ground to try to understand how this tomb over the past 4,500 years has deteriorated. And then I had some colleagues, an architect, and students reconstruct this using the drawing of the tomb and sort of a digital game of Lego here, putting all these little blocks, measured blocks back, to try to reconstruct the height of this tower, which we estimate stands about 8 meters tall. Nearby, returning to the site of Abu Sway, we found some other interesting things from this Umamnar Bronze Age period. We were there in 2012 and documented some Umamnar tombs. These are not something that the untrained eye would get excited about. You could really, if you weren't carefully looking, walk right over top of this without really noticing it was significant. And one of the things that really was touched on throughout a number of the talks today is the challenges archaeologists face in Oman and really around the world, sort of trying to preserve and protect cultural heritage, right? And so quite unfortunately, despite our efforts, these number of tombs in this area were bulldozed, right? And so a big part of our work is sort of public outreach. We're education having to do with the archaeological history, and the development in Oman is proceeding at such a rapid pace, right, that one of our challenges is just reaching out to local communities and trying to work very hard at signboarding and protecting some of this material. And these are some of the objects that came out of these tombs, right? So really some tremendous material. This is some soft stone vessel, pottery, shell, and other materials. And it's a running battle really to preserve and save some of this that we're working very hard on with the Omani Ministry of Heritage and Culture. One of the things Oman is really famous for, of course, is copper and bronze production. So the Bronze Age and later, not surprisingly, is known for bronze. This shows you some raw copper, but usually most of the copper in Oman comes in the form of copper in minerals that are found throughout Oman. And while today mining companies and modern production of copper is in search of big commercially viable deposits, right? They're not interested in small quantities of copper, but something we can really develop on as a commercial enterprise. Archaeologists, on the other hand, are interested in the really smaller quantities of copper that people have been exploiting and trading throughout the Middle East for at least 5,000 years. And a large part of our work with NASA satellite imagery includes work with hyperspectral imagery from this satellite here called Hyperion. That is akin to having 240 different pictures of different wavelengths of light on the ground. So this can tell you a lot about what you're looking at in terms of the geology. And so while we've long known for a very long period of time the geological formations in Oman that yield copper, what is much more challenging to do is to try to pinpoint where the copper-bearing minerals shown on this map, how they're distributed and how people were using them. And one of the things we've really learned is it's not only the presence of copper, but it's also the presence of water to grow the food, to supply the people doing this copper production, and also the presence of trees to produce the charcoal to smelt this copper, right? So as was mentioned earlier today, the search of trees to make the charcoal is very, very important from the Bronze Age and especially into the Iron Age, where you have hundreds of thousands of tons in the Iron Age and Islamic period of copper slag being produced in Oman. One of the sites that was discovered a handful of years back that's really critical in this regard and revealing just some of the astonishing things going on in terms of copper production is Safa, or Uqdat al-Bakara. And this is about 30 kilometers into the desert, was discovered on the edge of the Rubahali in the desert sand dunes. And there's hundreds and hundreds of furnaces or pits being identified first by Italian research and the Ministry of Heritage and Culture in this area, and hundreds of bronze objects like this dagger shown here. A lot of these are now, or a portion of these are on display in the new Oman National Museum. And one of the really intriguing questions about this material, and these images are from the archives of the Oman Ministry of Heritage and Culture, is just the impressive quantity of different material, daggers, axes, bowls, and other material that came out of this area and been subject to work by German, Italian, and a variety of different international teams. And so I'm really indebted to them for their impressive work on this material. And this is really akin, when I think about explaining this to my students, I oftentimes say this is akin to being, camping out in the desert. And let's say, for argument's sake, you were camping out in the desert and you had 1,000 iPhones. In a sense, this was what an iPhone is to us now. It's something incredibly valuable, right? And if you had, for argument's sake, 1,000 iPhones, I don't know how you'd have 1,000 iPhones, but say in a cardboard box or a backpack or who knows, you had 1,000 iPhones. You were camping out in the desert and somehow you were forced to flee really quickly. Maybe there's a sandstorm or you were attacked and you had to run away really fast, right? What most likely you would do is go back and find that material, or whoever attacked you would want to keep it, or you would go back the next week or a month or a period of time later and retrieve it, right? For some strange reason, in this case, that never happened. And this perhaps was buried deeply in a sandstorm that maybe transformed the landscape so dramatically that people were unable to find the spot, or for whatever reason, this material wasn't retrieved from this desert area. So our work at the site is really focused in on satellite imagery. We're using Japanese, German, Canadian radar. We're using GPR, or ground penetrating radar, to try to understand where people were living at this site, where were they getting water, why were they out here in the middle of the desert.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.